Negotiators from the U.S. and Iran wrapped up a round of indirect talks yesterday, meeting separately with Qatari and Pakistani mediators in Doha. Qatar says positive progress was made on issues related to the Memorandum of Understanding, with the two sides agreeing to continue discussions at a later date. Reuters cites sources who say the talks centered around traffic in the Strait of Hormuz and the unfreezing of Iranian funds. It comes as the Wall Street Journal reports President Trump has weighed a return to all-out war with Iran, holding multiple conversations in recent days with top Pentagon leaders, but deciding to stick with diplomatic talks, at least for now. That's according to U.S. officials familiar with the discussion, who add that Trump has told aides he's fine if negotiations with Tehran blow past an August deadline for a nuclear deal. I want to bring in MS Now's senior national security reporter, David Rohde, who is here on set with me. Start there, David, because I think initially over the weekend we were wondering, are these talks going to continue happening? There are continued inconsistencies between what the Iranians say is in the MOU and what the U.S. says is in the MOU. We're now taking those inconsistencies back to the negotiating table, but do we have any sense that there's any progress?
So far, I would say no. There's no sense at all. What's interesting is that the Iranians are sort of moving the goalposts, which they've done
continuously
for decades. And some say, and look, they're proud Persians. They're very proud of their heritage and the empire and the centuries of dominance the country's had in that region. But that doesn't justify what they're doing, which is moving the goalposts. They're now talking about, a full Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon before any other part of the talks can succeed, that they want that as a demand. It was peace in Lebanon was the wording in the agreement. And in the Strait of Hormuz, they're dominating, they're firing on ships. There's this new proposal that Oman has agreed to charge. Oman says there'll be voluntary fees.
Yeah.
When you've got guns pointed at your ship or your head, you pay those voluntary fees. That could be hundreds of millions of dollars. So the talks aren't going well. I think there's no way there's an agreement after 60 days.
And even as the president says, it's fine if we blow past that deadline. That's the diplomatic piece of it. He's also now having reportedly these conversations behind the scenes of let's renew an all-out war. There's talk of that being a way to finish the deal. And I think that is what I've heard from conservatives who are unhappy with the MOU, and they would like to see us finish it, but they want to know what they're getting for it. And I think it's unclear at this point, if you can't pressure Iran back to the negotiating table from continued and perpetual strikes in the first instance, what do you get by renewing that fighting?
To really make a difference, it would have to be massive all-out war and ground troops. That's always been the problem. And again, you can't wage war without being 100% behind it. I don't want ground troops in Iran.
Yeah.
But the Iranians know that Trump will not use ground troops based on his actions so far. And his verbal threats have just lost all credibility. I just think he's said this so many times, he's threatened them, that it doesn't really, deter them at this point.
And I also think that, we'll see ultimately what happens, but there's still just so much consternation on Capitol Hill as the administration tries to sell the idea that, okay, the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. That's a win for us. And I think many people on Capitol Hill privately will acknowledge, okay, that was the case prior to the war. So what do we have now by way of better national security interests and curtailing Iran's nuclear and proxy programs? I think that remains one of the key questions. So then, of course, as we're focused there, your beat has so many prongs to it. We're also focused a little bit closer to home, specifically around Bill Pulte as the acting director of national intelligence. And you've been digging into this a lot because I think even as Pulte is acting and Trump seems to kick the can down the road for confirming Jay Clayton, his more permanent pick that's much more palatable on Capitol Hill, there are real questions about what damage Pulte can do in terms of hirings and firings, but also in terms of potential leaking of information to try to support a narrative around the 2020 election that Trump lost and, of course, the election come November.
Yeah, I've talked to about a half dozen former intelligence officials about his powers as the director of national intelligence, Pulte, and also what they could do in terms of before, during, and after the elections. And the best line, and many of them said this, was, "You're not crazy, David," in terms of
which is always good to hear.
Concerns.
Yeah.
So just to frame all this, no president in American history has said the things he has said, where he continues to not accept that he lost in 2020 and is constantly saying the elections are rigged, from the California primary recently to constantly saying this, fake claims about mail-in ballots, trying to block mail-in ballots, trying to federalize elections, being pushed back by the Supreme Court. So never, ever in American history has an American tried this level of election interference. And then Bill Pulte and his new chief of staff, both have no experience in intelligence. Christina Norton, was the head of election integrity in the RNC. I spoke with her briefly, actually, when she got the job. She declined to say anything. She's very nice to me, but there's still really serious concerns about her history. She sent election observers across the country when she worked for the RNC. She ran their election integrity unit in 2024. President Trump won. It was a fair election, but that doesn't seem to matter. And one of the persons she sent out as an election observer was Jack Posobiec. He's the far-right conspiracy theorist who spread the Pizzagate conspiracy that Democrats were trafficking and sexually abusing children.
Yeah.
So it's a really bad look right now. Democrats are very concerned about Pulte. I think he's absolutely going to be in as the acting Director of National Intelligence through Election Day. That is why he's there.
And there are just questions because he has been such an overtly political actor, not just in the junk claims. I mean, this is not me saying this. Like, legally, he has had difficulty proving the federal housing allegations that have been made against people like Letitia James and others. And now to put him in this role with more substantial levers of power around an election that there are already concerns about, I think you're right to bring the rhetoric into the more tangible policy conversation. And that's the place that we will be watching and reporting. And I'm glad that you're here to keep giving us these early previews as you keep having these conversations. That reporting will be on ms.now soon. MS Now, senior national security reporter David Rohde. Thanks again.